Hey everybody, welcome back to the Genus Brewing channel. Today we're going to continue our series on home brewing myths, essentially things that we've known for years that aren't necessarily true when it comes to making good beer.
So we have a lot of people that come into the shop and they are dead set on their exact recipe, and they know that they can make that recipe and it's going to be the best every single time they make it. And what we're here to kind of tell everybody is you probably don't have that level of control.
Basically, home brewing has a lot of variables, and it makes it a lot more difficult to repeat beer like commercial processes do. So stay tuned, and today we're going to be going over recipe exactness, breaking down what really is important and what's going to be sort of out of your control. In the meantime, grab a pint, enjoy, or tea. Cheers.
Cheers. So first of all, let's break down your recipes and talk about what in your recipes you're looking for. And this is going to be style specific, so certain styles you'll be focusing on things more than you will in other styles. The biggest one we get is IBU exactness in IPAs.
Big one there. So people come in, they're paranoid about using an exact hop to bitter an IPA, and if the alpha acids on that hop aren't exactly the same, then they have to adjust this to, the point of where they need like 2.36 ounces to bitter their beer. And realistically, when you have something that's 70, 80 IBUs already, that's going to come down a lot more to your system, how you're boiling the hop, what kind of hop oils that hop has, whether it has a lot of cohemulone or other types of oils in it. That's going to actually affect the perceived bitterness a lot more
than just direct alpha acids themselves. So let's break this down a little bit. First of all, alpha acids in terms of what you have for your recipes is entirely an estimate, and it's going to be dramatically varying based on your system. So when you plug in your recipe to Inland or to whatever software you're using, it'll give you an estimated bitterness. There are 3 different scales usually used on the brewing softwares that are available. There's the Rager, the Tinsith, and another one.
I can't quite remember. Mori, I believe.
Mori, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Or no, that's
SRM. Yeah.
Sorry, my bad.
Rager, Tinsith, and something else. But anyways, so they're using different sorts of calculations to give you your estimated bitterness. But that doesn't necessarily matter because there are a lot of other things that contribute to the perceived bitterness.
So a big alpha acid that is known for contributing a sort of sharp bitterness is called cohemulone. And this is found in a variety of different hops to different degrees. Centennial is known to have very high levels of cohemulone. So I can almost guarantee you, and I encourage everybody to experiment with this, that if you bitter with Centennial versus another hop such as, say, Simcoe, that's known to have quite low levels of cohemulone, even though your calculators from your online software will say that they're both the same IBUs, the beer that's been bittered with Centennial will taste significantly more bitter.
Yep. Another one that I always say is plant matter bitterness. So a lot of people will get a more aggressive and assertive bitterness based on the essential oils that are in the hops, first of all, but also in just with the abundance of hops that you use, just from the bitterness of plant matter. And so if you're doing a heavy, let's say a Whirlpool edition, and your Whirlpool edition has 4 or 5 ounces of hops for a 5-gallon batch, you're going to get bitterness just off the fact that there's plant matter in a hot liquid.
And building on that, we can even kind of use a great example, which is a lot of the English style sort of stouts and beers of that such that traditionally you're going to use a hop like East Kent Golding that is actually really low when it comes to the alpha acid content. 4, 5, 6% is all. However, because you're using 3 ounces, of the pelletized addition as, say, like a 60-minute addition, and boiling all that plant matter, you're actually going to get a sort of different type of bitterness, and usually, like Peter said, a more assertive bitterness, even though your calculator will say that it's got a really low IBU level.
I think commercially here in the Northwest, we have a great example of a quote-unquote pale ale because it doesn't meet the IBU standards, which is Bale Breaker's Field 41.
Oh, yeah.
it tastes like an IPA. It has the assertiveness of an IPA, what you expect on your palate from an IPA, but it's a pale ale. And contrast that with, say, Manny's Pale Ale from Georgetown Brewing Company. In the same wheelhouse in terms of bitterness, calculated bitterness from the IBUs, but flavor difference is dramatic. Bale Breaker comes across with that assertive sharpness and a lot of hot flavors that make you think IPA, but based on the BJCP style guidelines, it's technically a pale ale just because of alpha acids.
Yep. And then the last thing I think we should cover with hops is the fact that I guess a better number to go by if you're still into calculating those numbers and you want something that's tangible in your hands, I would say to go by IBU to original gravity ratio, because essentially what's going to happen is as you increase your starting gravity, you're increasing the overall alcohol of your beer, you're also increasing the sweetness of your beer, and that's going to give you a better idea of really how bitter a beer is going to end up tasting in the long run. Because if you're brewing something like a session IPA, you can have only 30, 40 IBUs, I guess, worth of bittering in there, and that beer is going to be substantially bitter. Whereas if you're doing, something that's pushing a barley wine, double, triple IPA, that's, 80, 90 IBUs according to your calculators, but it's also 8, 9, 10% alcohol, that beer is probably going to be pretty well balanced because of that extra malt sweetness. And then at the same time, you'll have some effect of that alcohol actually having its own bittering effect in a beer like that.
Yeah, it's just a different, completely flavor from that. I mean, it can come across as a warming effect. It can come across as boozy. It can come across as a lot of different things when you have that higher alcohol playing a role. So on the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about beers where IBUs actually do matter and you have to focus a little bit more on them. These are going to be beers, generally speaking, on the lighter end of the IBU spectrum, as well as the overall flavor threshold.
Yeah, so something like blonde ales, Hefeweizens, or even a great example is a recipe that we've been working on, which is just a light American lager, something that's low in alcohol, low in overall grains in it. So we only hop that to about 13 IBUs. Something that small is going to actually have a pretty significant impact, say, even if you're off by a few IBUs, because of how delicate that beer is going to be.
Yeah, there's just not a lot of flavors to cover it up. And the other side, or the other type of beer where IBUs will matter, is when you're using atypical bacteria or yeast to ferment your beer, because those are actually affected by both the IBUs and the other oils that are in the hops that you're using.
Exactly. A great example of that would be lactobacillus. There's several strains of that. Some can tolerate a little bit more, but several strains can only tolerate 8 or 9 IBUs, and after that they just kind of crap out on you and won't do anything. So
if you're brewing beers like that, it's a little bit more important that you stay focused on what you're hopping your beers to. But if you're doing something like a super imperial IPA, don't sweat even if you're 10 IBUs different, because honestly your calculators are probably off by that much anyway.
All right, so on to our next subject, which is going to be variations in yeast. And a lot of people will come into our shop here and they want a specific yeast strain, and it has to be that yeast strain. A great one would actually be one with New England IPAs, but that have been a big hit this summer, and they all want the specific Conan strain. And what it kind of comes down to with these strains is that there's usually several analogs to one specific type of yeast. Usually there's at least one dry version to every liquid version, and as well as every manufacturer is going to have essentially the same strain, and if they don't have that same strain, it's probably going to be a strain that's so similar that you won't notice the difference.
So this actually goes back to something that we said a little bit about in our previous Brewing Myths video, that it comes to knowing your yeasts. And it's not necessarily that each yeast fermented the exact same way has an analog if it's fermented the exact same way, but some yeasts have analogs if you can ferment them in a different way than you would ferment a certain yeast. And so, for example, if you have a very neutral yeast, let's say USO5, 1056 Chico Ale strain that you can ferment on the warmer end of the spectrum, and get relatively low to zero fruitiness, generally clean beer, you can ferment the same beer with a different yeast and maybe ferment it at a colder temperature to get basically the same effect. For the most part, especially with clean strains, these methods that you can use when you know your yeasts correctly are so similar that you will not be able to taste the difference. There are some unique exceptions, but for the most part, there's always an analog that's going to work really well for you.
And that also depends, I guess, on what kind of beer you're brewing too, where a lot of times the strain might be a little bit more important if you're brewing a beer that's, fairly low in alcohol, light in color, delicate character overall. That yeast might have more of an impact than, say, if you're brewing a beer that's a little bit higher alcohol, darker color, something that, say, is really malty. The effect, I guess, net-wise of different yeast strains is going to be much less significant than if you have a very basic, simple beer.
Mm-hmm. So again, just comes down to knowing your yeasts and how they're going to react to different sets of to environments, different styles of beer. And the rule of thumb is the more flavors you have covering up your yeast, the less you're going to taste your yeast. So
I think ultimately what it comes down to with yeast is I would recommend focusing less on getting a very specific strain and more on essentially how you're fermenting your beer, because ultimately that's going to have a much larger impact on the quality and flavor of your beer than having a specific strain will have. Something that most homebrewers aren't really aware of, that just because Peter and I are basically immersed in a world of hops and other ingredients, is going to be year-to-year variabilities. Hops, as well as even grains, will have that same sort of impact. And what happens is these are crops. These are things that are harvested. And guess what? Weather and climate is not the same every single year. And so these things are actually going to change, and climate and weather have a significant impact on the flavors of the ingredients we use. So even though we use, for instance, Mosaic all the time in a hop-forward beer, I noticed the 2016 crop seems to have this really pungent, great peppery character, where the year before's crop was much more fruity. So things like that are something to kind of sort of consider, and not to essentially fret on trying to replicate a beer by using the exact same strain of hop. And that's something that a lot of people overlook when they're trying to build recipes, trying to be repeatable, is just the fact that these ingredients in themselves have quite large variabilities.
We get people in here that they brewed a beer last year, let's say, and that beer last year they used 1.25 ounces of this, 0.5 ounces of this, etc. And they come back with the exact same recipe saying it's going to be the exact same beer the next year. And the fact of the matter is, we've had hops that we've seen go from close to 5 IBUs down to 2 IBUs. Alpha acids, sorry. So a huge variation in alpha acids, upwards of 3 alpha acid units difference between years. And that's not the only variable. So some people will try to combat this by going with AAUs or HBUs, but that still doesn't account for the variances in all the other oils in the hops. So it's just like wine. You don't expect the same crop of wine to be the exact same year to year without a superfluous amount of blending. It's the same way with hops. Your hops aren't going to be the same year to year, and so if you have the exact same recipe one year versus another year, you have a different beer.
And this can also be transferred on to grains, more specifically specialty grains. That's one thing I notice when we get grains from either different maltsters or even just different batches from the same maltster. A lot of times these grains can vary substantially in their flavor profiles, and that just has to do with slight variations in the malting process, and back to that whole weather and climate impact and
even maltsters will admit that you have the economy of scale working for you. If you're a very large maltster, they can blend a lot of different crops and analyze the different barleys that they're getting in to make sure that they have the exact same protein content, etc., before they go into the malting process. But without that economy of scale, which most maltsters that have great malt that you're looking for, especially specialty malts, they don't have that. And so they're getting different grains in every time that they're malting a new batch, and it's going to have some slight variances. You might not notice the difference overall. It might be something that's so small that you can't really tell, but it's still one of those things that does create slight variations that deters from the repeatability of beer.
So to round out what we've covered today, what it kind of comes down to is, on a scale of home brewing There's so many things that change every time you brew a batch, from yearly ingredients to differences in your system and slight deviations in how you might brew from batch to batch. It's very hard to be repeatable, and yet it doesn't mean that you have to worry about it. It doesn't mean you're going to make bad beer.
Yeah, you'll make good beer. Just don't be so focused on making the exact same beer overall, because honestly, not even just with the things that we've talked about, but with a lot of other variables that homebrewers have, just with economy of scale, and that comes down to thermal mass differences, which can create temperature fluctuations, the fact that you're probably using different pieces in your equipment every single time, that you haven't had the volume, the number of batches to dial in a certain mechanism based on differences in your alcohol percentage that you're going for. So brewing on your system, for example, if you're brewing a 4% beer that has a grain bed that's going to be yay high versus a larger beer which has a grain bed that's going to be yay high, that plays roles too. There's a lot of variables in the homebrew scale that people don't take into account, and the ultimate takeaway from all this is relax, have a homebrew.
Like Charlie P would say.
Quoting some famous words.
Alright, so anyway guys, we hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like down below and subscribe if you want to see some more homebrewing myths. Check out our other video. We'll probably try to do one more in this series, and until then, cheers, have a homebrew, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers guys. The IBU to... How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So anyway, grab a pint or tea and enjoy.
Cheers.
Ow, hot. I like it.
Sweet.